We begin with those allegations of fraud at Minnesota child care centers. Federal officials say they're freezing payments across the state.
$18 billion at least they've stolen from Minnesota and from the United States.
Federal fraud investigations in Minnesota are no longer slowing down. They're expanding, and this time, they're unfolding on the streets, not behind closed doors. In Minneapolis, federal agents are conducting door-to-door investigations, knocking on the doors of daycare facilities suspected of collecting public money while providing little to no services in return. The atmosphere has shifted, with unmarked vehicles lining quiet blocks and investigators stepping out with folders, badges, and warrants in hand. At the center of the operation is a simple question that refuses to go away. Millions of taxpayer dollars were paid out, but where are the children those funds were meant to support? Viral footage brought this issue to light, exposing businesses that appeared active on paper but remained nearly empty in reality. Now, the same federal government that was once deceived is returning to reclaim every dollar, widening its focus as signs of deeper abuse emerge. For many Americans watching from the outside, this crackdown reflects a growing sense of exhaustion as jobs disappear, insurance costs rise, and daily life becomes increasingly complex. At the same time, public systems are quietly exploited from within.
Federal enforcement moved with speed and intent once the video spread across the country, because the images left no room for quiet handling or delayed response. In Minneapolis, teams from ICE, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security entered the city as if stepping into hostile ground, not with press releases or meetings, but with coordinated field units ready to move street by street. Unmarked vehicles rolled into residential blocks before sunrise, engines idling low, radios muted, and agents watching entrances where daycare signs still hung on doors that had not opened in weeks. The pressure was immediate and visible, as national attention forced federal agencies to treat the situation as an active pursuit rather than a slow review of documents. Homeland Security investigations took the lead, treating the case as a criminal operation from the outset, which altered the course of every action on the ground. This was not a routine administrative visit, and it did not resemble a compliance check where forms are exchanged and warnings are issued. Agents approached each address with the expectation of deception, moving in pairs, scanning windows, checking locks, and listening before they knocked. When the doors opened, questions followed quickly and precisely, focused on who worked there, who was inside, and how many children were supposed to be present at that hour. Every answer was cross-checked in real time against prepared files, turning each doorstep into a test of truth. The door-to-door approach forced the suspected networks into the open, as there was no safe distance from scrutiny once federal authorities hit the sidewalk. Agents walked past playgrounds that showed no signs of use, past faded posters promising care and education, and stopped at buildings where lights remained off despite records claiming complete enrollment. In some locations, the silence was heavy, with empty rooms and untouched supplies revealing the minimal activity that actually occurred. Outside, neighbors watched from behind curtains as officers moved from one location to the next without pause. The pursuit had a rhythm: knock, question, document, and move, and that rhythm repeated across the city. As the search continued, the contrast between paper records and physical reality became impossible to ignore. Official filings described thriving centers operating at full capacity, yet agents stood in hallways where footsteps echoed because there were no children present. Chairs were stacked, toys were boxed, and classrooms appeared frozen in time, as if the doors had been locked long ago. Parking lots remained empty during the hours when parents were supposed to arrive and depart, and no school buses appeared, despite schedules that claimed daily transportation. Each empty room added weight to the case, turning suspicion into visible proof. Federal teams treated each site as a potential crime scene because the pattern repeated too often to be dismissed as a coincidence. Agents photographed interiors, recorded observations, and logged inconsistencies with meticulous precision, knowing that every detail could later be used to define charges. Doors that stayed locked raised immediate questions, while sudden attempts to open facilities during inspections only deepened concern. The absence of children was not attributed to weather or holidays, as records showed continuous funding tied to daily attendance. The pursuit was no longer about verifying paperwork, but about exposing a system that functioned only on forms and claims. The focus on sanctuary jurisdictions shaped how the operation unfolded, because these areas offered conditions where fraud could survive in plain sight. Now, limited local oversight and reduced cooperation created gaps that organized schemes learned to exploit. Federal agents understood that such environments allowed false operations to exist openly, protected by distance from enforcement rather than secrecy. In these neighborhoods, fraudulent activity did not hide behind fences or guards, but behind routine and trust. That reality forced investigators to rely on direct observation rather than assumptions. Connections between financial fraud and illegal labor also began to surface as agents examined who staffed these locations and how they were paid. Employment records often failed to match the people found on site, while some facilities showed signs of labor exploitation tied to broader criminal behavior. The operation expanded in scope as each finding pointed toward networks that reached beyond childcare alone. What initially appeared to be a misuse of public funds began to resemble a coordinated effort that involved multiple violations simultaneously. The pursuit grew more serious with every door that opened, revealing another space. The presence of federal teams changed the atmosphere across Minneapolis because the investigation unfolded in full view of the public. Residents saw agents moving with purpose, saw notebooks fill with observations, and saw doors marked after inspections. This was not a covert crackdown, nor was it a symbolic gesture intended to appease critics. It was an enforcement push driven by pressure, evidence, and the need to regain control over systems that had been quietly abused. Each step forward carried the weight of national attention. As the operation continued, it became clear that the damage extended beyond lost money, because the misuse of childcare funds struck at families who depended on legitimate support. Every dollar diverted weakened programs meant to protect children and working parents. Federal agents treated this understanding as part of their mission, reinforcing why the pursuit could not be slowed or softened. The investigation pressed on through block after block, guided by preparation and real-time findings rather than assumptions. For readers following this story, now is the moment to subscribe to Military Power and share your first reaction in the comments, because what began with one video has turned into a citywide enforcement push. By the end of the first phase, the pattern was undeniable, yet agents continued to document movements, timing, and responses, knowing that early observations often expose intent before suspects adapt or disappear under pressure. The deeper question remained unresolved, leading directly into the next section, where the scale of funding collides with the reality of nearly empty daycare centers. Federal agents returned to one address repeatedly, not because it was dramatic from the outside, but because every visit revealed the same empty truth. The daycare building sat on a quiet street, its painted sign still hanging above the door. Yet the windows showed no movement, and the lights stayed off long after the opening hours listed on official records. When agents stepped onto the sidewalk, they slowed their pace, scanning the entrance, checking the doorframe, and listening before knocking. Inside, there was no sound of children, no voices, and no motion that matched the funding records tied to the location. This facility had received nearly $1.9 million in public funds, and the amount followed the agents everywhere they went. It appeared in printed files, digital records, and handwritten notes carried from one inspection to the next. The amount was large enough to demand attention, yet small enough to hide within larger budgets for years. Each time the door opened, the question grew sharper because the money had arrived on time, but the children never did. Inside the building, agents moved room by room with the same caution used during organized crime searches. The floors were clean, but unused. Chairs were stacked along the walls, and toys remained sealed in boxes. Classrooms showed no signs of daily activity, with no drawings, no scattered supplies, and no wear on the carpets. Agents documented each detail carefully, marking timestamps, angles, and distances, knowing that absence itself was evidence. The air inside felt stale, as if the space had been waiting rather than working. State authorities had already declared the center closed, yet activity resumed whenever inspection schedules were announced. Agents observed vehicles arriving shortly before expected checks, unloading children who appeared unfamiliar with the space. These arrivals were brief and controlled, designed to create the appearance of normal operations. Once the inspectors left, the activity ceased again, and the building fell silent once more. This pattern repeated often enough to remove doubt about intent. Safety violations followed the location like a shadow, recorded over several years without forcing lasting change. Broken equipment, blocked exits, and missing staff certifications appeared in inspection histories. Each violation stood on its own as a warning sign, yet together they painted a clear picture of neglect. Agents reviewed these reports while standing inside the same rooms, comparing written warnings to physical reality. The mismatch between funding and care became impossible to ignore. Outside, the parking lot remained empty during peak hours, with no signs of parent traffic or daily routines. Neighbors confirmed that doors stayed locked most days, and no regular drop-offs occurred. Agents watched the street from parked vehicles, noting the absence of morning and afternoon activity. No buses arrived, no crowds gathered, and no patterns formed that matched the reported enrollment. The stillness carried more weight than any testimony. This location was not treated as an isolated case, but as a working example of a broader structure. The files showed similar financial flows to those of other facilities with the same warning signs. Agents compared layouts, staffing claims, and inspection histories across multiple addresses. The similarities were striking, suggesting a method rather than coincidence. The daycare receiving $1.9 million became a reference point, not an exception. As enforcement continued, attention shifted toward earlier warnings that had failed to stop the operation. Auditors had raised concerns more than a decade earlier, flagging dozens of cases that followed the same pattern. These findings were not hidden, and they were not unclear. Records showed precise estimates pointing to hundreds of millions of dollars lost each year. Yet action stalled, and files were closed without resolution. A specialized task force had once taken these findings seriously, moving beyond reviews into direct action. Search warrants were served, documents were seized, and digital records were copied for analysis and examination. Teams gathered evidence that outlined how funds moved and how oversight failed. For a brief period, momentum built toward accountability. Then, the task force disappeared without explanation. Agents reviewing the old files noticed how abruptly the effort ended. There were no final reports, no completed prosecutions, and no clear transfer of responsibility. The work stopped. Those involved were reassigned and the cases returned to storage. Fraud continued uninterrupted, following the same structure year after year. Whistleblowers who raised alarms faced growing pressure as their warnings went unanswered. Some reported being isolated at work, while others described subtle threats that discouraged further cooperation. The message was clear, even without confrontation. Speaking up carried consequences, while silence allowed operations to continue. Agents noted these patterns as they reconstructed timelines. The daycare, which received $1.9 million, fit perfectly into this history. Its violations, funding levels, and inspection patterns matched earlier cases almost exactly. The difference now was visibility. Public attention had removed the shield of quiet neglect that once protected the system. Agents understood that what they were seeing had survived because it remained unnoticed. During each visit, enforcement teams treated the building with the same seriousness reserved for organized criminal sites, evidence bags filled with documents, photos, and recorded observations. Timelines were built from surveillance logs and inspection reports. The absence of children remained the most substantial proof, standing in direct contrast to financial claims. Agents avoided assumptions and focused on repeatable facts. Money arrived. Facilities stayed empty. Inspections were staged. Oversight failed. These points required no interpretation. They formed a chain that linked the past to the present. The case no longer depended on opinion, only on records and observation. As teams packed up after another inspection, the building returned to silence once more. Doors closed, lights stayed off, and the street resumed its quiet rhythm. The operation continued elsewhere, but the pattern had already been established. This location had shown how easily a system could be used and reused without immediate resistance. The investigation proceeded with renewed focus because what happened here suggested deeper protection and longer timelines than initially expected, leading directly into the next section, where attention turns to how entire sanctuary environments allowed such operations to function openly for years. Federal enforcement did not slow as the case moved into political territory because pressure from outside only sharpened activity on the ground. As public debate intensified, agents continued operating with the same methods used in major gang crackdowns, moving early, staying quiet, and focusing on control rather than visibility. The streets around targeted locations remained active with surveillance, and vehicles rotated positions to avoid patterns. Investigators understood that once a case draws political attention, suspects adapt quickly, making timing and precision critical. Statements from state leadership entered the public space, while operations continued behind the scenes. The governor described the growing criticism as scapegoating, framing the investigation as an attack rather than a response to evidence. On the ground, agents did not react to speeches or headlines because their task remained unchanged. They followed schedules, checked logs, and tracked movements with the same discipline applied during organized crime cases. The separation between words and action became clear as enforcement continued uninterrupted. Critics responded with their own pressure, accusing state authorities of shielding fraud for political benefit. While debates filled screens and speeches filled rooms, federal teams focused on sequences rather than statements. They mapped how funding approvals aligned with election cycles, noting the timing without concluding. Patterns were logged quietly, treated as data rather than arguments. Each recorded connection became another thread for later review. Agents observed that certain facilities consistently received funding, despite repeated warnings. Inspection failures did not halt payments, and closures did not stop financial flow. This consistency raised questions that could not be answered solely through politics. Investigators documented each instance where enforcement actions lagged behind known risks. These observations created a timeline that showed how benefit and inaction overlapped. As the case expanded, the investigation shifted toward the movement of money beyond individual sites. Financial analysts traced transfers through accounts that showed rapid inflow and withdrawal patterns. Funds moved in ways that suggested coordination rather than chance. Transactions were broken down by date, amount, and destination, forming a map of activity that extended beyond childcare services. The money trail became a path leading outward. Field teams supported this work by gathering information on who controlled accounts and who authorized spending. Employment records often failed to match payroll claims, raising concerns about labor practices. Some workers appeared briefly during inspections, then vanished from records entirely. These inconsistencies suggested illegal labor arrangements tied to the same funding sources. Agents treated each finding as part of a larger structure rather than an isolated problem. The investigation also uncovered signs of human exploitation, indicated by irregular work hours and missing documentation. Individuals associated with certain facilities showed signs of dependency and control, common in criminal labor operations. Agents approached these cases carefully, prioritizing safety while collecting evidence. The presence of exploitation shifted the tone of the operation, adding urgency to the pursuit. Surveillance expanded to cover meetings and movements outside daycare locations. Investigators tracked vehicles traveling between addresses linked by funding records. These routes revealed connections between operators who appeared unrelated on paper. Observations were logged patiently, allowing patterns to emerge over time. The network became clearer with each monitored movement. Political arguments continued, but enforcement avoided public conflict. Agents neither accepted nor rejected accusations made by either side. Their role was to observe, document, and act where evidence allowed. This approach mirrored strategies used in dismantling gang networks, where silence and consistency often achieve more than confrontation. The case advanced through accumulation rather than declaration. As financial links grew clearer, enforcement teams coordinated with specialists focused on labor violations and trafficking indicators. Joint operations increased information flow without altering field behavior. Agents continued to visit sites, check records, and conduct interviews with the same steady rhythm. Each step reinforced the view that daycare fraud served as a gateway to broader criminal activity. The expansion of the investigation brought new locations under scrutiny. Warehouses, offices, and private residences tied to financial records were added to watch lists. Activity at these sites suggested coordination beyond childcare services. Meetings occurred at irregular hours, and access was tightly controlled. These behaviors matched patterns seen in organized criminal groups. Agents adjusted their tactics to maintain pressure without exposing themselves. Surveillance teams rotated shifts, and contact points changed to prevent detection. Information moved through secure channels, ensuring that findings remained protected. The operation demanded patience, as rushing could compromise years of work. Each decision reflected experience, gained from prior investigations into gangs and cartels. The broader scope of the case reinforced a central understanding among investigators. Daycare fraud was not the final objective, but the visible layer of a deeper system. Financial abuse opened doors to labor exploitation and potential trafficking. The investigation treated these links as connected threats rather than separate crimes. This perspective guided every action moving forward. As political debate continued to escalate, enforcement remained focused on facts gathered in silence. Agents are prepared for long-term engagement, knowing that exposure often leads networks to shift rather than collapse immediately. The hunt required endurance as much as speed. Each documented movement brought the operation closer to clarity. By the close of this phase, the investigation had reached a turning point, with evidence extending beyond public programs into hidden networks, setting the stage for the next section where sanctuary environments and local protections would come under direct scrutiny. What began as a short video shared online has now evolved into something far larger and more challenging to contain. A few minutes of footage were enough to expose several gaps within a system that had operated for years without real challenge. That exposure did not stay on screens. It mobilized federal agencies, prompted investigators to enter neighborhoods, and transformed routine streets into active enforcement zones. The shift from online outrage to door-to-door action marked the moment when suspicion gave way to pursuit. The investigation moved fast once it reached the ground. Federal agents did not remain behind desks or inside offices. They knocked on doors, stepped into empty buildings, and walked through spaces that were supposed to be filled with children and activity. What they found instead were dark rooms, locked doors, and silence that did not match the substantial amount of money flowing into those facilities. Each empty daycare added another layer to the case, transforming individual locations into proof of a wider pattern. As the search expanded, the focus shifted away from individual buildings and toward the structure that held them together. Funding records continued to show full operations, while physical inspections showed the opposite. The contrast was too sharp to ignore. What once appeared to be isolated misuse began to resemble a coordinated system that knew how to evade inspections, delays, and warnings. The investigation no longer revolved around a single center or mistake. It centered on repetition. That repetition raised more complex questions. When the same failures recur repeatedly, responsibility extends beyond the surface. Empty daycares pointed to something more profound than negligence. They suggested planning, protection, and a level of confidence that only grows when consequences never arrive. The longer the investigation continued, the clearer it became that this was not simply about missing children or misfiled paperwork. It was about how public money could be drained quietly while oversight looked the other way. From this point forward, the implications stretch beyond Minnesota. If these gaps remain open, there is no reason to believe the problem stops at one state line. Programs built on trust and limited oversight exist across the country. Networks that learn how to exploit one system rarely stop after a single success. They adapt, repeat, and expand, carrying the same methods into new places where attention has not yet arrived. The conditions that allowed this case to grow are not unique. That reality places pressure on federal authorities to act earlier and with greater force. Waiting for videos to go viral is not a strategy. By the time public attention forces action, damage has already spread. If these patterns continue unchecked, future investigations may need to move more quickly, strike broader, and rely less on local response. The pursuit seen here may become a model rather than an exception. What remains clear is that this case did not begin with arrests or headlines. It started with silence. Silence inside buildings that were supposed to protect children. Silence inside systems that were supposed to watch closely. Breaking that silence required exposure, pressure, and sustained enforcement. Whether that pressure continues will shape what comes next. If you want to follow how stories like this unfold, subscribe to Military Power, where we break down the real-world pursuits, investigations, and confrontations that often remain hidden until it is too late. And now the question is yours. Do you believe this is merely budget fraud, or is it a sign that a deeper system is finally being exposed?